Hello, and welcome to the third session of the lecture series on Science and Faith for Practical Apologetics 334A. In our time, we will be deliberating about the biological perspectives in the ideological scientific world and the structures that demonstrate the complex details that support the creator issue. To begin, we will open with the biological ideologies that are prevalent throughout the scientific world and address some of the weak theories. Altogether, this will look at evolution, its effect on the fossil records, and exclusion of God, as well as spontaneous generation and irreducible complexity. When discussing the concept of evolution, we must consider the mistake of equivocation that can easily cause confusion and dissension between parties. There are multiple ways in which evolution is broken down, with varying levels that begin with small changes and work up to common ancestry, or qualifications like macro and micro. One thing that remains consistent among all the classifications is that there are multiple types of evolution which should be differentiated. Microevolution is often described as small changes or genetic developments within a species that can be observed by scientific processes, while macroevolution is large-scale generational interspecies morphing from a common ancestor that has yet to be witnessed in any way. It is perfectly reasonable to agree with the former, but reject the latter, and still hold both scientific consistency as well as biblical faith. Still, it is important to realize that as Christians, our salvation is not dependent upon beliefs about how the world was created, though it is vital to hold to biblical incorruptibility, even in reference to God creating the world. On the subject of interspecies evolution, we see that it is flawed because God gave all creatures the ability to reproduce after their own kind. The ideas under macroevolution are not scientific due to their lack of substantial evidence and inability to practice replication in any way throughout scientific history. Many people turn to the geological column and fossil records to defend their dedication to Darwinian descent, but this falls apart in that there is no record of true intermediary species, and rock layers were likely laid down in quick succession rather than over millions of years. With the extent of supposed changes that would have occurred, we would expect to find many halfway transformed animals. Yet over the dense amount of fossils we have, there has been nothing but hoaxes and imaginative articulations. Even the layers of sedimentary rock that make up the column have anomalies, such as trees that transpire across more than one layer, and events similar to the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which displays the speed of how quickly the layers can be built up. What we end up seeing through our scientific research is evidence for the biblical flood and consistency with God's established system of reproduction. When contemplating Darwinian evolution, many come to the result that evolution excludes the possibility of a creator. Contrary to popular opinion, this is a false assumption. Evolution, whether the scientific occurrence or biogenesis theory, has no effect on the metaphysical world. Thus, whether the evolutionary theory is correct or false, it strictly pertains to the natural world and has no impact on the spiritual world. Evolution cannot kill God, as so many neo-Darwinists claim. Science is unable to confirm or deny anything in the incorporeal realm. This also has connotation for our ability to unequivocally prove God's existence with tangible evidence. It is impossible, yet inability to establish a truth does not negate the truth. There are many other robust supports of the presence of the biblical God, but in the end, one must entrust faith that the Bible is reasonably true. As scientists attempt to discover the world with a godless cosmology in mind, they have striven to form theories of spontaneous life. Two remarkable experiments come to mind: Francisco Redi's spontaneous generation of maggots and Miller-Urey's life in a test tube. Both of these theories have come to be known as misrepresentations of reality, though we still find life in a test tube prominently displayed in our museums and textbooks. In Red-Eye's experiment, allowing the meat to remain in open air presented flies an opportunity to reproduce, and reminds us that all life has a parent life at its foundation. With Miller-Urey's system, there are several glaring flaws: the exactness of each measurement, its isolated system, and even the type of amino acid produced, which all make this completely improbable as the source of life. Neither one of these theories is reasonably capable of generating life. Another contribution to our inability to have spontaneous generation is the subject of irreducible complexity. This is the idea that life and nature have complex, intermingled functions that do not act properly if one element is reduced in any way. Every system in existence does not necessarily have this dependency, but most have at least one thing that cannot operate without its counterpart. It is not simply a complex article or even reduction to elements that are used for a different purpose. It is elements that are useless to the organism in a reduced form, and complex due to their intermingled reliance. The only possible result of irreducible complexity is concurrent construction, which is not conceivable as an attribute of evolving initiation. As we have considered the biological concepts, it is time to investigate the biological structures that affirm our prior conclusions. Zooming in slowly, we will review the bodily systems, human cells, DNA structures, the genetic code, and bacterial flagellum to see their implications on biogenesis. Starting with the largest function that we will be covering, we see the human body and its structural systems. While each system is necessary part of anatomy, with the nervous system controlling action, reaction, and reception, or the digestive system processing food into nutrients and energy, we will be focusing on the cardiovascular system. There are a few important things to recognize in this function: that it is the core function of the body, it possesses defense protocols, and on its own it is useless. Unlike any other system of the body, the lungs can go without oxygen for a short time, and a lack of food does not immediately cause the stomach to collapse. But if the heart stops beating, the body has no chance of surviving. Then there are the defense reactions, which fight off viruses and bacteria that infects the blood, as well as clotting, which prevents continuous bleeding out and builds up a defense against outside contamination. Lastly, the cardiovascular system, though most central, is completely dependent upon the other bodily systems. Without the brain, the heart would not know to contract and release. Without the muscular system, there would be no ability to pump blood. Without the digestive and respiratory systems, blood cells would not be capable of bringing oxygen and nutrients to each part of the body. This remarkable system, with its complexity and interrelated dependency, is too entangled within the remainder of the body's functions to act properly without them, and none of the other systems have purpose without blood. Moving from bodily systems to the cells which make up these systems, we see the unimaginably complex arrangement of proteins that work in the human cell. Broken apart, there is the mitochondria, which turns sugars and nutrients into energy, which powers the cell and causes it to respirate. The plasma membrane that holds everything together and protects the internal pieces from contaminants as well as Golgi apparatus, which transports and modifies polypeptide strands into usable proteins. This does not even cover half of the vital portions of the cell. There's also the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulums, ribosomes, and many other irreplaceable functioning parts. Every single object in the cell's makeup causes the cell to perform its bodily duties, and macroevolutionary theory has no way of accounting for the various complex structures of the cell. Within the nucleus of our cell, we find the special chemical chain of deoxyribonucleic acid, which is colloquially known as DNA. Having an extraordinary helical structure chain of nucleotide acids, this minuscule column contains the unique code to every human being. Even in its tiny state, DNA is more complex than any man-made code in existence, and is so compactly coiled that it is invisible to the naked eye, while unraveled it reaches approximately 2 meters long. In its structure, it has 4 chemical molecules and a sugar phosphate backbone that holds the strand together. These 4 chemicals are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, through which 2 DNA strands are bonded together by hydrogen bonds that are always paired off as A with T and C with G. Each of these nucleic acids has an important job, and the DNA strand would not function properly if reduced in any way. Without the backbone, it will not hold the structure, and thus the codes scramble, and there is no order. None of the pieces are expendable, and life does not have self-replication or reproduction without the DNA code. When the DNA strand is coiled, it forms what we call a chromosome, which holds the genetic code of each particular person. Within a singular nucleus, there are 46 chromosomes that form 23 chromosomal pairs, and these have DNA pockets called alleles that determine characteristics. Each characteristic is passed on from parent to child and can be traced back through each generation, even if a trait remains dormant for a very long time. This determines the color of one's hair and eyes, their skin tone and height, as well as every other bodily aspect. Yet not a single person has the exact same scheme as any other. Among siblings even, there is such a great amount of variety from each parent's alleles that they can have their own genetic code and still resemble their family members. Considering the simple trait of brown hair, determined by one allele and dominant among the hair colors, there are still various shades ranging from nearly black all the way to almost blonde, and sometimes with tints of red interspersed. Revisiting the pairs, there is perfect balance in the number of chromosomes. If there was one less, cells would not have enough genetic material to function properly, and adding one more creates the genetic disorder of Down syndrome. Altogether, genetics is an extremely detailed system that is delicately balanced and irreplaceable in the cells of each living being. Switching gears a bit, we find the flagellum motor in bacteria propulsion, composed of about 30 different proteins working in tandem. The flagellum is a more orderly version of many man-made movement machines that happen to retain irreducible complexity. If just one protein were removed from the motor, it would be incapable of rotation and useless to the organism. While this argument has been contested by the type 3 secretion system needle, due to the fact that both have 8 to 10 similar proteins, this is based on misrepresented perspective of the way in which something is irreducible. While the flagellum does contain the parts to the needle, the particular types of bacteria that contain a flagellum have no use for a needle, and would not have begun with one in order to eventually reach a state of movement. Another flaw in the needle objection is that scientists believe that the type 3 secretion system was developed after the flagellum, which would make it improbable for the needle to evolve first. Rather, the picture would be the motor devolving into the needle. This all goes to show how intricately and well ordered each portion of the universe is, and that it is reasonable to conclude that everything was designed by an intellectual mind. As we conclude, it is important to recognize the beauty in biological processes and how accurate scientific practices are analogous with biblical doctrine. Thank you for listening to the Science and Faith lecture on biological perspectives. This is my bibliography if you would like to research more for yourselves. Please, blessings in Christ.